The courtroom was bustling with activity as case after case was called. It was one of those mornings where the judge, known for his short temper and quick judgments, seemed to be in no mood for lengthy arguments or any form of resistance. The air was thick with tension as attorneys, defendants, and spectators whispered among themselves, each wary of catching the judge's attention. In the midst of this, a black woman stood out, not just because of her presence, but because of her composure. She wasn't frazzled like many others in the room. Dressed sharply, she carried herself with confidence, her voice steady as she addressed the court. She was challenging a fine that she believed was unfairly imposed, and her arguments were clear, logical, and calm. But the judge didn't see her as someone worth listening to. He didn't hear the sense in her words or the professionalism in her tone. To him, she was just another case to rush through, another person standing in the way of finishing his docket on time. He leaned forward on his bench, visibly annoyed, and interrupted her mid-sentence. "That's enough," he snapped. "Your argument is irrelevant." The woman didn't back down. She kept her tone measured and respectful, but she firmly tried to explain why the fine was unjust. This only seemed to infuriate the judge further. His face hardened and his voice rose as he cut her off again. "I said that's enough. I will not have my courtroom turned into a debate hall. If you can't respect this court, then you can leave it." The woman took a deep breath, visibly restraining herself from reacting emotionally. She opened her mouth to speak one last time, but before she could get another word out, the judge made a decision that would change the tone of the entire room. "Remove her from my courtroom," he bellowed, slamming his gavel down for emphasis. The room went silent. Everyone froze for a moment, unsure if they had heard him correctly. Then two court officers moved toward the woman. She didn't resist, but the humiliation on her face was unmistakable as they grabbed her arms. The officers, with firm but unnecessary force, began to drag her toward the courtroom doors. The spectators, many of whom had been only half paying attention to her case moments before, were now fully engaged. Gasps and murmurs filled the air. People exchanged glances, some shocked by the harshness of the scene, others muttering judgments under their breath. "She didn't seem like someone who deserved that," someone whispered. "She's so calm," another murmured. "Why isn't she fighting back?" As the officers pulled her through the courtroom, her head remained high. Her heels clicked against the polished floor, and though her steps were forced, she tried to maintain her dignity. Her calmness wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a refusal to let the judge's actions break her spirit. But the humiliation was undeniable, and her lips pressed tightly together as if to keep her emotions in check. The judge, meanwhile, didn't spare her a second glance. He adjusted his papers and called for the next case, as if what had just happened was no more than a routine part of his day. The woman disappeared behind the courtroom doors, but the tension she left behind lingered. Whispers continued to spread among the onlookers, each person wondering who she was, why she had been treated so harshly, and what would happen next. This moment wasn't just about her removal, it was about how she was perceived and dismissed without a second thought. It was a moment of power being used against someone who had dared to stand her ground, and the feeling of injustice was palpable. What happened next would shock everyone in that room, including the judge himself. If you're captivated by this story and want to know what happened when the truth about this woman was revealed, be sure to subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click the notification button so you don't miss the next part of this gripping story. Trust me, you won't want to miss how this courtroom drama takes an unexpected and powerful turn. The courtroom fell silent as the bailiffs continued to escort the woman toward the door. Her heels scraped against the polished floor with each step, the sound echoing louder than the judge's earlier gavel strike. It was a sound that seemed to underline the injustice of the moment, a reminder of the imbalance in the room. The woman didn't resist the officer's firm grip. Her shoulders remained squared, her back straight, but the humiliation of being forcibly removed in front of so many people was evident. As she moved closer to the exit, she muttered under her breath, her voice low but firm, "This is an abuse of power." Her words weren't loud, but they carried enough weight to make those nearby pause. Some spectators exchanged uneasy glances, while others looked at the judge to see if he had heard her. If he had, he didn't react. He was already focused on the next case, shuffling papers as if nothing unusual had occurred. Near the back of the courtroom, a woman leaned toward her companion and whispered, "She doesn't seem like just anyone. Did you see how calm she was?" Her companion nodded, watching the scene unfold with a mix of curiosity and discomfort. "Yeah, most people would be yelling or crying by now. Something about her, I don't know, she doesn't seem ordinary." As the woman reached the doors, the bailiffs released her, their job done. They avoided meeting her eyes as if they sensed they were part of something unjust. She paused for a moment, adjusting her coat and brushing imaginary dust from her sleeves. It wasn't an act of vanity. It was her way of reclaiming some measure of control after such a public display of power. Once outside the courtroom, the heavy doors closed behind her with a resounding thud, sealing her away from the crowd. She stood still for a moment, her expression unreadable. The hallway was quieter, almost empty, but the echoes of what had just happened seemed to linger in the air around her. She took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling slowly as she tried to collect herself. Her dignity remained intact, but the sting of the experience was undeniable. Being dragged out like that, with no chance to finish speaking, had been a deliberate act of silencing her voice, and yet she didn't crumble. Her gaze shifted back to the closed courtroom doors. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a mix of determination and defiance flashing across her face. It was as if she was silently saying, "This isn't over." At the far end of the hallway, a janitor paused his work to watch her. A young man carrying a stack of legal papers slowed his steps. His curiosity piqued. It was clear to anyone observing that this wasn't just another disgruntled defendant. There was something commanding about the way she carried herself, even in the face of humiliation. Meanwhile, back inside the courtroom, the atmosphere hadn't returned to normal. Although the judge continued with the next case, the spectators were distracted. Whispers floated through the room, quiet enough to avoid the judge's attention, but loud enough to create a ripple of intrigue. "Did you see her face? She didn't look scared," one person murmured. "Yeah, but who just accepts being dragged out like that without putting up a fight?" Another replied, "What if she's someone important?" The conversations weren't loud enough to disrupt the proceedings, but the woman had left an impression. Even those who initially thought the judge was justified began to second-guess the situation. Outside, the woman took a step forward, moving toward the benches lining the hallway. She sat down carefully, smoothing her skirt as she did. Her expression was calm, but her mind was racing. It wasn't the first time she had been underestimated, but it was one of the most public and humiliating instances she had endured. Still, she knew better than to let anger consume her. Anger made people careless, and she wasn't about to give the judge or anyone else the satisfaction of seeing her lose control. Instead, she began to mentally prepare her next move. This wasn't just about the fine anymore. It wasn't even about the way she had been treated in court. This was about something bigger, standing up to authority that wielded power irresponsibly. She glanced at her phone, checking the time. She knew that soon enough, the judge would learn exactly who he had just dismissed. A young clerk stepped out, his arms full of files. He paused when he saw her, his eyes widening slightly in recognition. She gave him a brief nod, her calm nature throwing him off. He scurried away, clearly unsure of what to say. The woman leaned back slightly on the bench, her eyes returning to the doors. She wasn't done here, not by a long shot. What happened next would turn the entire courtroom on its head, forcing everyone to rethink their assumptions about her. Inside the courtroom, the judge leaned back in his chair, a smug smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. He shook his head and muttered, "People think they can talk their way out of anything." His tone was dismissive, his confidence unshaken after ordering the woman out. He turned his attention back to the stack of cases in front of him, ready to move on as if nothing had happened. But not everyone in the room shared his ease. One of the court clerks, seated off to the side, stared intently at the paperwork in their hands. Something wasn't adding up. Flipping through the documents, their brow furrowed deeper with each passing second. Finally, they hesitated, glancing toward the judge. "Your Honor," the clerk began, their voice uncertain. The judge barely looked up, distracted by the next case. "Yes? What is it now?" The clerk cleared their throat, holding up a paper. About the woman you just had remove. The judge's pen paused mid-signature. Slowly, he raised his head, his expression irritated. What about her? She isn't who you think she is, the clerk said, choosing their words carefully. The judge leaned forward, his brows knitting together. He was no stranger to disruptions in his courtroom, but the clerk's tone was unsettling. And what exactly do you mean by that? The clerk glanced around nervously, aware of the many eyes and ears in the room. Moving closer to the bench, they lowered their voice and whispered something inaudible. The judge's eyes narrowed as he listened. He leaned back in his chair, his face shifting from curiosity to disbelief. He opened his mouth as if to question what he had just heard, but the clerk, still whispering, handed him a document. The judge snatched the paper and scanned it quickly. His confident demeanor faltered, and for the first time that morning, he seemed unsure of himself. He reread the document, his jaw tightening as realization dawned. The whispers in the courtroom grew louder. People noticed the sudden change in the judge's expression. What's going on? One person murmured. Did he make a mistake? Another whispered, leaning closer to get a better look at the bench. The judge's face hardened, his authority masking the embarrassment creeping in. He dropped the paper onto his desk and glanced toward the courtroom doors, the same ones through which the woman had been dragged moments ago. Bailiff! He called sharply, his voice cutting through the murmurs. One of the bailiffs stepped forward, their posture stiff. Yes, Your Honor. Bring her back in, the judge ordered, his tone leaving no room for argument. The courtroom fell silent again. Spectators exchanged glances, confused but intrigued. This was far from the routine cases they had come to expect that day. The bailiff hesitated for a fraction of a second before nodding and hurrying toward the door. The judge tapped his gavel against the desk, not to restore order, but as a way to mask his growing frustration. For a moment, the judge sat alone at the bench, his thoughts racing. He prided himself on being in control, on knowing everything happening in his courtroom. Yet here he was, blindsided. His earlier confidence felt like a distant memory, replaced by a nagging sense of regret. He glanced back at the document, the woman's name printed in bold letters across the top. The title beneath it was unmistakable. He shook his head, wondering how he could have missed such an important detail. The spectators grew restless, whispering among themselves once more. Why is he calling her back? One man asked. Maybe he realized he messed up, someone replied, their voice tinged with curiosity. The courtroom doors creaked open again, and the bailiff returned. The judge straightened in his chair, his face unreadable. All eyes turned toward the hallway, waiting for the woman to reappear. The energy in the room had shifted entirely. What had started as a routine day in court now felt charged with tension, the kind that made people sit up a little straighter and lean in closer. Whatever was about to happen next, everyone could sense it was something they wouldn't forget. The courtroom doors opened once again, and the hush that fell over the room was almost palpable. The bailiff stepped aside as the woman walked in, her posture still perfect, her face composed despite the events that had unfolded. This time she wasn't being dragged out, she was being escorted back in, and she moved with a quiet strength that made every eye in the room follow her. As she entered, the room seemed to hold its breath, the tension thick in the air. The judge, who had just moments before been full of authority and dismissiveness, now seemed a little less certain of himself. His eyes tracked her every move, trying to regain control of the situation he had clearly mishandled earlier. The woman walked straight toward the front of the room without hesitation, her gaze fixed on the judge. There was no anger in her expression, but neither was there fear or uncertainty. She stood tall, her presence commanding attention. It was clear that, despite being dragged out in front of everyone, she wasn't about to let the situation shake her. The judge cleared his throat, trying to return to his usual commanding tone, but there was a slight tremor in his voice as he addressed her. Miss Carter, he began, his words slower now, as if weighing each one carefully. I've been informed you're a federal prosecutor. Is this true? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. It was a quiet sound, but it grew louder as the people around the room began to piece together what had just been revealed. Eyes shifted from the woman to the judge and back again, the shock beginning to settle over everyone. The woman's calm, dignified stance had now taken on a whole new layer of significance. She didn't flinch. She didn't falter. Instead, she gave a sharp nod, confirming the judge's words. "Assistant United States Attorney," she clarified, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the tension. For a moment, the judge didn't say anything. His gaze stayed fixed on her, his expression hard to read. The room was still, the whispers now growing in the background as people processed what they had just heard. A federal prosecutor? That explained why she hadn't reacted the way most people would when being treated so unfairly. The judge's face shifted. His earlier arrogance was gone, replaced with a look of confusion and unease. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but the words didn't come immediately. His eyes darted over the papers in front of him again, as though he was trying to find some piece of information that might explain the disconnect. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, the judge cleared his throat and said, "I wasn't aware of your position, Ms. Carter. I should have been." His voice was softer now, though it still held the weight of authority. The woman stood still, her eyes never leaving his. There was no pride in her gaze, no satisfaction in the judge's reaction. Instead, her expression was one of quiet resolve. She wasn't here to make him apologize or grovel. She was here to make him recognize what had happened. "I understand," she said evenly, "but my position shouldn't matter. What should matter is how I was treated, how anyone would be treated in this courtroom. I wasn't given the chance to finish my argument. I wasn't given the respect every person in this room deserves, regardless of their background or job title." Her words echoed through the room, cutting through the tension like a sharp knife. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, visibly taken aback by her calm yet powerful words. The courtroom, still filled with people, was now completely silent, everyone hanging on her every word. For the first time, the judge seemed to grasp the full scope of his actions. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a reflection of how he had judged her based on assumptions, based on who he thought she was, not who she truly was. The realization hit him harder than any harsh word could. "Ms. Carter," he said, his voice quieter now, "I deeply regret what happened here today." She nodded slightly, but her expression didn't soften. "Regret isn't enough. We need to make sure this doesn't happen again, to me or anyone else." Ms. Carter turned back to the spectators, her tone softening but remaining firm. "This isn't just about courts or judges. It's about workplaces, schools, neighborhoods, everywhere. It's about creating a culture where respect and fairness are non-negotiable. And that starts with us. Each of us has the power to speak out against injustice, to hold others accountable, and to demand better." She allowed her words to settle before continuing. "But this change doesn't happen by staying silent. It doesn't happen by looking the other way when we see someone being mistreated. It happens when we use our voices, when we educate ourselves and others, and when we stand together for what's right." A few people in the courtroom nodded, clearly moved. Some exchanged glances as though realizing for the first time how deeply this moment resonated. Ms. Carter stepped closer to the edge of the spectator seating, addressing everyone directly. "To those watching this unfold, don't let it stop here. Share this story. Talk about what you've seen and heard. Challenge those in power to do better. And if you believe in building a system where fairness is a priority, be part of that change." The judge seemed to pause, considering her words carefully. Then, in a rare moment of humility, he nodded. "You're right. I will do better." But the woman wasn't waiting for a second apology. Her presence alone had already made the statement she needed to. With one last steady look at the judge, she turned and walked out of the courtroom, her head held high. As she exited, the courtroom remained still, but a shift had occurred. The judge's authority had been shaken, and the lesson of respect and fairness was one everyone in the room would remember. Outside the courthouse, Ms. Carter stopped briefly to address a growing crowd. Cameras flashed and voices called out questions, but she simply repeated what she had said inside. "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us. Let's make sure no one else is treated this way again." As she disappeared into the crowd, her message spread. Online, in conversations, and in the minds of those who had witnessed it firsthand. Change had begun, and Miss Carter's defiance had lit the spark.